All right, so this week what I want to talk to you about is Aristotle. So you had Socrates, and Socrates taught Plato, and Plato taught Aristotle. So Aristotle lived roughly 384 to 322 BC. And he's a fairly prominent figure. We would especially say that his student was prominent. We call him great. It was Aristotle who tutored Alexander the Great, the great Greek emperor that conquered the entire known world at the time. Now, it was Aristotle that founded the Lyceum, which was his own school, and it was famous for him walking around as he lectured and taught with his students. And I came very close this week to just carrying the camera and trying to walk around where I am and lecture, but I thought that I would have a hard time with that, and no doubt that would be difficult for you watching it. And so I thought this would be just kind of simple. But you need to know that it was Aristotle who was known for being kind of the father of logic. And so for centuries after they've lost Aristotle's writings, they lean more toward Platonic philosophy, but they still used Aristotle's logic. For Aristotle, he believed that all reality is located in this world. So you'll contrast that with Plato, right, who believed that everything here represented something that existed as a form elsewhere. Think of Plato's caves. So for Aristotle, he kind of turned that on its head, and his view was that all things here are the reality, they are the real substance, but that what happens is they're characterized by their substance-ness. So for instance, a chair, right? So for Plato, a chair merely represents the form of the chair that exists in a perfect world, you see, but for Aristotle, this is a chair. It is a chair that is defined by its chairness. And so for Aristotle, he didn't exactly reject Plato's forms outright. Instead, what he did was he kind of collapsed the idea of forms and causes into what he called his four causes. And so it's important that you know, for Aristotle, he had four causes. These are the answers to the questions of why. And you could answer just about anything based on one of these four answers. So you had the material cause. What is it made of? You had the formal cause. That's the shape that it takes, its form, right? You have its efficient cause, which is how it's made, and you have its final cause, which is why it's made. And so I'm putting in your slides in the PowerPoint that I want you to download and I want you to study. I'm giving you some examples that I want you to see. But I want to ask you this question, or I want you to wrestle with this question. Is there anything that you can think of? Is there any why question that can't be answered by one of these types of causes? The material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, or the final cause. And as we think about Aristotle, I think it's important that we consider what historians, what students of philosophy who have kind of defined as Aristotle's God. Now, there have been attempts throughout history to kind of baptize the thinking of Aristotle and to turn him into a Christian thinker. I don't think that that's proper. I don't think that that's accurate, but I do think Aristotle gives us some interesting things to think about when we think about God. You see, for Aristotle, there had to be some sort of uncaused cause. Remember, he's defining everything by causes. But he says at some point you go back, you keep pushing it back. A cause for this, a cause for this, a cause for this. His whole point is that at some point there had to have been an uncaused cause, or what he'll call a prime mover. This was the very first thing to move forward. See, in his mind of thinking, anything in motion had to be actualized. Anything that moves had to have been moved except for the one thing that was moved on its own. Any potential to be actualized, had to be actualized by something, and that was what he calls this first cause. We, Christians, theists even, would say that sounds a lot like God. At the end of the day, there's a lot of things I want you to know about Aristotle, and there's so much in your reading. I would encourage you this week to really spend time not just reading your book, but trying to understand it, really working through it. And I want you to know that there were a few thoughts that kind of arose after Aristotle, and you need to be able to distinguish these. You need to be able to know and distinguish what cynicism is. Cynicism used satire and parody in order to criticize societal structures. But ultimately, cynicism ends up being invalid and hollow because it can't actually answer anything. It can't actually define anything. It can't actually offer anything constructive. It only serves to be critical and deconstructive. In addition to cynicism, there's also skepticism, which frankly says that you can never be certain of anything, which is really awkward because how can you be certain that you can't be certain? It doesn't quite work. There's also Epicureanism. Epicureanism aimed for peace and tranquility. It sought for kind of this peace and tranquility. That was its aim. There was Stoicism, whose most famous adherent was the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Now, for Marcus Aurelius, he believed that there was an impersonal God, but a rational world. And so he approached life rationally rather than seeking joy. So we think of Stoicism, we think of that kind of that stiff upper lip, holding all things together. That arose out of the Stoic philosophy that teaches that you fundamentally can't do anything about what happens to you. You just have to accept it and keep plowing forward. And then the last thing I want you to know that arose after Aristotle was the teaching of Plotinus or Plotinus. I'm not really sure. Well, either way, I'll let you say it however it sounds right in your head. But he believed that there were several levels or layers of reality. And so for him, there was the highest level of reality, and that was the ultimate source. That was the ultimate cause, very similar to Aristotle's prime mover and uncaused cause. Below that, he held that there was a from and below the one. So from, emanating from, and below, beneath, the main thing comes intelligence or the mind. And this is actually what would be roughly equivalent to the God of Stoicism. Number 3, below that, it's from and below the intelligence comes the level of the soul, and then below that are the body and objects in the world. You're also reading the Sire book, the Universe Next Door, which your papers are being based off of, and looking at worldviews. You see, I'm convinced that one of the reasons why we don't understand one another and we have such a hard time speaking with people is because we don't recognize that they're coming from a different worldview. And so whether we approach that from the stance of missions, right? How do I communicate the gospel of Jesus Christ to them? It's important that we understand their worldview and we understand kind of where it's soft and where its struggles and where its difficulties are. But it's also important that we can actually communicate our own worldview, a biblical worldview. In addition to that, it's helpful from just the perspective of getting along and being able to have intelligent conversations. It's helpful to know where they're coming from. It's helpful not just to deconstruct them and to poke and prod and make these accusations against them. It's just helpful in our conversations to be able to know where they're coming from and why they're coming from it. And so my encouragement to you this week is get your reading done, but don't just read to fill the page quota. Don't just read to be able to check off that you've read that chapter. I want you to read so thoroughly that you understand what you're reading. There's a lot of reading, I get that, but I want you to read it to understand it. I want you to do your reading in the Sire book so that you can write your paper. I want you to do well on the quiz. So if you're struggling with these quizzes, let me encourage you for a moment, okay? If you're struggling with these quizzes, let me acknowledge that in some ways these are designed to be fairly difficult. They're designed to be tough. But because they're designed to be tough, they're designed in such a way that I can give you grace on your papers. I can give you grace on your final project, but those quizzes are they're holding that standard for you. So I would encourage you not to become discouraged with your quiz grades. If you're really struggling, reach out to me so that I can help.